Good morning and happy Sabbath. Welcome to Douglasville Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath School class. We're happy to have all those here that are in person and those that may be joining online vicariously, I guess you could say. I don't know. At least it's not cold out there or rainy. We've had cold, we've had hot, we've had rainy, we've had all versions in between. It's kind of overcast. But it's beautiful to see the flowers starting to bloom, a little preface of spring, but it always gets me down with the allergies whenever this time of the year happens.
That's what's happened to me. As soon as I started sneezing, I looked at my
Yeah,
phone and it says pollen.
yeah, yeah,
And just a couple of weeks ago, it said pollen 9.
yes. Pollen is working on us all. We'll have yellow on the cars before long. All right, well, let's bow our heads and get started. We'll have prayer and then we'll get into the lesson. Dear Father, thank you for Sabbath. Thank you for freedom to dig into your word, to share it with others, to meet together, and allowing us to learn more about you and to apply it to our lives. Please help the Holy Spirit to be here with us this morning and help him to guide us into all truth of you as you have promised. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so our lesson this week is planning for success. What is a definition of success? Robert, what's your definition of success?
Completing this journey in life to a positive end.
Completing this journey in life to a positive end. What's our world's definition of success? Money, power, status, right? I had a respiratory therapist. His name is Robert Strickland that I used to work with up at Floyd for years, and me and Robert had these wonderful dialogues. We kind of sat on different sides of the aisle politically, but we had a lot of respect for each other. And he reads prolifically. I like to read, but I can't keep up with Robert. He reads prolifically. And he gave me a book one time. He said, I want you to read this. And it was about the rich and the famous and how they've died. And it talked about James Dean and Jim Belushi and just on and on and on and on and on. And it's just example after example after example of people that had power, money, fame, acclaim, status, and they kind of self-implode. Like a lot of them died from drugs, not necessarily just from overdoses per se. Many of them did commit suicide or had self-destructive habits which led to their death, like illicit drug abuse in huge amounts or whatever, or alcoholism or whatever. But then also really reckless, like James Dean was flying, right? I mean, he was moving in his little Porsche. And so there's a lot of other examples of that, how there's this self-destructive thing. So the world's version of success seems to line up with Satan's principles, right? If it leads to our self-destruction, that's Satan's ultimate goal for us, is he wants to self-destruct us. And so I think there's something important to be gained from that. Biblical success or godly success is something we as Christians are called to try to find and emulate. Yes, sir.
I saw an interview with a lottery winner.
Mm-hmm.
They asked him, happiness and so forth, and they said, winning a lot of money doesn't change anything. Basically, if you're unhappy before, you'll still be unhappy. If you're happy before, you'll be happy. It just amplifies whatever you're at. Whereas these famous people, they got this, and if they were seeking happiness, they were unhappy before, it amplified their condition.
Yes.
And they tried, of course, self-medicating or whatever. And even in the case of James Dean or whatever, adrenaline rushes are a form of that same thing.
He's trying to find stimulus or excitement or happiness, whatever. Yep. And so I think that I think that we have to be very aware. One of the biggest predictors of success be it worldly or godly, I think is what you call delayed gratification, right? And so psychiatrists have studied people, psychologists have studied people, and when they put the marshmallows in the room and the kids that could, you know, have delayed gratification, they've studied them later in life, they had more success by worldly standards, okay? But still, in the Bible, we're called to have delayed gratification. And what's the biggest impetus to us having delayed gratification? Contentment, not wanting what Robert has or Rob has. I want what God has for me, in front of me. I'm living within my means.
I think the other thing is this, whatever you do to the glory of God.
Sure.
That,
But what is the world standard? Do the glory of who?
yourself.
Me, right? That's the world standard. So the biblical standard is radically different than the world standard. It's do to the glory of God, right? Work as if for the Lord.
Well, and what that also is saying is, there's no such thing as minor work.
Right.
There's no such thing as major work. If you're doing it to the glory of God, He sees it all as completely equal in His sight.
Yes. So I'm going to read from Friday real quick because that's a good segue. I'm going to read two quotes here. On Friday it says, "That which lies at the foundation of business integrity and of true success is the recognition of God's ownership." Now I'm going to stop right there for a second. You're going to have to bear with me. When we see God as creator and originator of all in our life, that's the biggest form of delayed gratification, is my theory, okay? My argument. If we see him as creator and us as just a steward of what he's created and just a tool that he's allowed to be here on earth and we're really beholden to him, then we have a grounding and a foundation that won't be shaken as long as we keep him there. Now, if I'm compare myself with the Joneses and I'm trying to get the latest car, the latest house, or the latest boat, or the whatever, I don't have a foundation. You know what I mean? It's all a house of cards. It's a deck of cards that can be blown away really easy.
It's a moving target, Tim.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just like these people that I talked about that are rich and famous, successful, they were always seeking a newer stimulus, right? So the lesser stimulus, be it a drug, an alcohol, an experience, a risk-taking, they needed bigger and bigger stimuli to get that rush again, okay? And it's similar with, you see this. I mean, I just wasn't feeling good earlier this week, and so I binge-watched Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff. That was a true deck of cards. And like he had,
House of cards, right?
house of cards, deck, whatever. It was just a shambles, right? It was all a facade. It was all fake. There was no real foundation there. And for years he kept this thing, this little gerbil, wheel of robbing Peter to pay Paul balance somehow, you know what I mean? Wow. And then it all finally came down, you know what I mean? Like even in the early 2000s, he didn't actually fail. Well, actually I think he went insolvent in like 98 about. But he didn't fail, I think it was 2006 or 2007 where it all crashed. But the crazy thing about it was, he had this large screw art device in his office. And the people in the mockumentary, whatever you want to call it, they were like, it's almost like that was a subtle hint to the world. You know, this is what I think of the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so God's principles doesn't call us to abuse others or take advantage of others. He robbed millions of people of their retirement. And, nurses, teachers, all kinds of people that had invested and thought they had a valid investment because they'd done their due diligence. I can't tell you how many people in the story kept saying, well, I did my due diligence. They had an article about him in the Wall Street Journal about his expertise. He was on the board of directors for the NASDAQ. You know what I mean? So he had this perfect little thing, and it was a world power, prestige, whatever, but it just crashed.
You know what I think about when I think of that? Tim, is think of the energy that it took to keep that wheel moving.
And how many
That
lives?
energy.
Well, the people in his offices that he totally trashed their life, right? He had
Yeah.
2 offices.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how. It's like he had one that was on the, I don't know, 19th floor, I think, was his main office where it was above board and legitimate. And then he had another office where it was all the illegitimate Ponzi scheme going. And they were totally 2 different standards. It was 2 floors down. I think it was the 17th floor was where the Ponzi scam was. It was people he'd hired for their loyalty. They didn't have the education or the knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. And it was probably not until the late 90s, early 2000s that the computer operators really realized, hey, what we're doing is wrong, and we're probably going to go to jail for this one day. And they started raising red flags to him, which he doubled their salary, from $60,000 to $120,000. You know what I mean? So it's like, how many people did he trash their lives? And it's just crazy. But when you have a bipolar existence, you have a facade, and then you have a real world. That's not godly, right? We're called to be transparent. We're called to be. So I think if we have God and we recognize his ownership, the creator of all things, he is the original proprietor. We are his stewards. At that we have, all that we have is a trust from him to be used in according to his directions. So as Christians, we're to follow his direction, not our own, right? I'm watching The Chosen, and I encourage you, if you get a chance, to watch it some. And so last night, Jane and I were watching it, and the thing that there's all this license there. Like, we don't know what the dialogue was from minute to minute, okay? But I think that the guy's done a pretty good job, because it's like James and John are saying, oh, we need to go here, we need to go there. And they're like sitting at supper one night, and they're like, I'm just tired of arguing every day about where we're going to go. And one of the disciples says, don't. Well, don't do it anymore, because we're always going to follow what God tells Jesus he wants him to do. That's where we're all going. We're following Jesus, and that's just it's kind of like it all hit with me. I'm like, duh. That's how we are. I mean, we're really always trying to pull off on what we want, yet the reality is we're to follow Jesus and his Father's will, what he wants us to do. The other quote, let me read this. I'm way away from this. Let me read this real quick. Because of the pressure to provide for our families, many times we think that our work is simply to provide an income. But as Christians, we also face doing our part in the Great Commission that Jesus gave all of his followers. By quoting this commission is found in Mark. After quoting this commission as found in Mark 16:15, Ellen G. White wrote, not all are called to be ministers or missionaries in the ordinary sense of the term, but all may be workers with him in giving the glad tidings to their fellow men. To all, great or small, learned or ignorant, old or young, the command is given. And so that talks about we all have a part, right? And no matter what our part, even if we're not at the highest peak of the part, we still have a part. We have a part to play. And God's Great Commission can't go out as effectively if we're not playing our part, if we're not a piece of the organ or the body of Christ that helps carry out that mission. Yes, sir.
Well, when you talk about him being a creator, that's absolutely true. Even a greater is that he chose to not be honored as that, but to lay down his life for you.
Yes.
Just to give you the opportunity, not the guarantee,
Yeah.
of choosing him for salvation. That is almost a greater honor than him being creator. And I think it probably is. That's where he will be honored by God, and we will cast our crowns at his feet.
Yeah.
Because we know he's the creator, but the honor for him to see that as not important compared to the love he had for us.
I think that I've said this a bunch. You talk to a builder, would a builder rather build a new house or remodel an old house? The old house, there's always unknowns, there's things you find, it's not as predictable. They know the cost of everything that's going into a new house. It's easier to build a new house. And so this Ellen G. White tells us the same God that created is the recreator. It's the same powers he's using at creation in our recreation, right? And so I think it's similar to the builder. It was pretty easy for him to create us. You know what I mean? I mean, it's in God's scope of power to create us, and that's not that challenging for us. I think that what is a challenge is our will and our recreation. We're always pulling, just like I said with the disciples, saying, I'm tired of arguing about where we're going today. And the one says, well, don't argue about it. We're going after God's will. Wherever God's will is for Jesus, that's what we're following. That's where we are at in this world all the time. I am. I want to go my way, do my thing, and not follow God's will. And I think that that's the biggest part of delayed gratification, or the biggest part of spiritual success, is that if I can submit myself to God's will, I'm going to be a success in what matters in life.
Amen.
Spiritually.
That's right, Tim.
But
And that's all it really
yes.
counts.
Who do we fear? Who did God tell us to fear?
Fear God.
Yes, but who
Or
not?
Or him that can destroy the soul and body.
Him that can destroy the soul,
Yeah.
right? That's what he says to fear. And so the only way that we can avoid that, like we talked about, Satan's ultimate goal is, just like with Bernie Madoff, he destroyed lots of lives, right? He just decimated. Like, I can't tell you how many people they had to sell their house, they had lived at this certain status, they had an income coming in from him, and all of a sudden their world was just gone. They had to totally change their lifestyles. And many had to go back to work after their retirement. You know what I mean? And so he destroyed all these lives, and that's ultimately what Satan wants for us. He wants us to go down this path of destruction, right? He doesn't care if it's alcoholism. He doesn't care if it's overwork, right? Work is a good thing we're seeing in this. We're called to work. But you can take it too far to where you're working 80 hours a week. You have no quality of life. You have no family. Your family's is detrimental to your family and your relationships. That's not godly.
Or even the promise of riches.
But see,
And that's what a lot of those people are going after. Hey,
Yes.
This is a deal.
Yeah.
I'm going to get rich on this.
Even, what's our guy in Atlanta that, CNN?
Oh, yeah. Come on.
I'm totally blank. Ted Turner. When you talk about him, when you hear him tell about his life, okay, he talks about his father. And his father was this very hard, always working businessman that rarely had time for his son. And so when he did talk to him, it really landed. And he became very similar to his father by his own description of his father. And, he was working 80 hours a week. He's been through multiple marriages. And yes, he built an empire, but at what cost? You know what I mean? At what cost? And honestly, when you get to the end of it, he didn't seem to be particularly satisfied with the CNN or the Braves or all the different things that he had. He kind of retired to Montana on a ranch. You know what I mean? And so the things that matter the most, that give us the most joy, are frequently our family, nature, being in nature and seeing God's beauty. You know what I mean? Like, these are the things that matter. And interpersonal relationships. God calls us not just to have a relationship with him, but we have the horizontal here. We're supposed to have a relationship with each other, and we're not supposed to be damaging either. When you look at Bernie Madoff, he trashed one of the biggest investors that he had from Europe, that had royalty, all kinds of people that were in investing in Madoff, he committed suicide, right? Like 6 weeks after this all came down, he was in his office and committed suicide. And part of the thing talked about how, okay, if there was a couple of guys that were trying to talk to that businessman, that investor from Europe that had all these European ties, saying, what if we're right? They recognized that it was a scam. They'd notified people. They were taking it upstream and tried to get the SEC to investigate, and had given them evidence of how they could see this was wrong, and nothing had really happened. And they're sitting with this guy, and he says, okay, what happens if it's wrong? What happens if we're right and you're wrong? He said, I'm dead. That's what he said. This is 2 years about before it all came down.
Wow.
And he ended up committing suicide because he had no recourse. He had all of his earthly gain in that system, almost. And all of his family, he was from royalty over in England or something, or connected with it. And all of his family and friends and connections, he had steered that way. Everybody. And they all had these huge repercussions from it.
Well, like the crowns that Jesus will give us in heaven will have a star to the relationships that we had, right? And I don't believe there will be a single person in heaven that won't have at least one.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible
Yeah.
to not have an influence.
Yes. But that's not what our world tries to tell us, right?
No.
If it's two consenting adults, what? It's all right, right? But let's get in. Do I have a volunteer to read Ecclesiastes 12:1? And I need somebody else to read Genesis 29:9 through 20. Who's got Ecclesiastes 12:1?
Okay.
Robert?
Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them.
When's he telling us to remember our Creator? When we're young. Why is that, John Boy?
Well, I think a lot of times the lessons that we learn in our youth, they stay with us the rest of our life.
Right?
It defines your roots. Where do I come from?
Yes.
You know, why am I here? You know,
And
that's
so when you have a root, you have my mother died in 2013, and so she was the matriarch of the family, right? And so she was like home plate for the family, right? We all went there for Christmas, Thanksgiving, whatever. It was almost like home base. And so when you have that root, Mom would always call me on anything. She had no shame, right? It was her job to, if she thought I was stepping out, it didn't matter if I was 40, it didn't matter if I was 2. She called me on it. And that was her God-given job to me. And now I didn't always appreciate it, but I can tell you Mom was 9 times out of 10, probably 99.95 times out of 10 was right, okay? I didn't always appreciate it at the time because I thought I was right. But the reality is, when you have that foundation or that somebody that can kind of help keep you grounded, Nick Chubb from up in Cedartown, he's a very famous football player. He's a running back. And he comes from Chubbtown, which is a little area just outside of Cedartown that has all of his family there. But when he comes home, he's like, Mom doesn't pay attention to what, Mom's still Mom, the same Mom he had forever, and she grounds him. And if she doesn't agree with something, she calls him on it, and he accepts it. That's the unique thing with him, is he accepts it. He accepts his family intervention in his life to keep him grounded and have a foundation. You see that folks that will accept that rebuke or correction, whatever you want to call it, they're more likely to be successful, right? They're more likely to have spiritual success because they have this accountability partner. If I had always rejected my mom's, I did sometimes right then, but later on, I always appreciated the wisdom of that. You know what I mean? Maybe I didn't appreciate it right then. It was kind of grated or hurt. But looking back, I really appreciate everything she ever did, even though I might have been mad about it at that moment.
so. Another thing, you see what that builds, Tim, is humility, doesn't it?
Humility,
Yeah.
absolutely, Dick.
Yeah.
And so pride goeth before a fall.
Right.
You see all these people like Dean, we talked about the rich, famous, that have worldly success, but they died from drugs, self-destructive behaviors, right? And a lot of times they weren't willing. They had people that were their foundation, but they weren't willing to listen to them. Jim Belushi had people, like I think they were from Illinois or Midwest anyway. I don't remember if it was Illinois, Indiana, wherever. Like Midwest, good culture, salt of the earth farmer people that didn't believe in what he was doing. And he had multiple people in the book about him that I read. He had multiple people trying to call him back, and he rejected it, right? He just kept going. It was this. And so humility is a big part of this. All right.
Let me say one thing on this. Also, taking the scriptures as a whole, we serve one of two masters, it says.
Mm-hmm.
When we make poor decisions to serve the wrong master, we put ourselves more and more under his control.
Yes.
And like in the example of Job, when we are serving God, God protects us from the evil one.
Right.
Doesn't mean that trials won't come, but the assaults of Satan are thwarted by God. Satan even said so.
Mm-hmm.
Evil days are there because, in most instances, when we say evil days, not trials. Trials and evil days are different things.
Yeah.
But evil days, when we are under the control and authority of Satan, as we said earlier, his purpose is not our happiness.
Right.
His
It's not.
purpose is to
Destruction.
keep us, in a way, his purpose right now is to keep us in a form of addiction so we will not see God.
Yeah. Doesn't matter what kind of addiction.
Yeah.
No matter what. It could be a healthy addiction like overwork. I mean, we associate work, and we're getting to the point where God says we need to work.
Yeah.
But even if it's just overwork, that's an addiction or a
Distraction.
unbalanced life
Yeah.
in an ungodly way that leads us into his trap.
And there's no addiction that doesn't have a root in unhappiness.
Yes. Or self-destruction.
Well,
Yeah.
that's all
You know?
built the same.
Yeah.
So, and that's why I have no delight in that, because
Yeah.
it's a terrible thing, and I think we've all experienced it, to do the wrong things and see Satan's influence on our lives after that happens.
Sure. Right. We're not happy when we respond in a wrong way towards somebody or hurt their feelings or whatever, or cause them to have an untoward outcome in some project we're working on. Like, that doesn't feel good, right? You don't want to hurt others. And
Well,
so,
I think that if we all step back and we make wrong decisions, it is usually pretty obvious when we think about it to see the influence of Satan that follows it.
yes. All right, we need to get to Genesis 29, 9 to 20. Who can read that for us?
Jacob meets Rachel by the well, right?
Yes.
And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, shouldst thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her.
So right before this, I'm going to get back to this just a second. Right before this, in the chapter before this, he had the dream of the ladder. He met with Jehovah, and it said he made a vow in 28:20. It said Jacob made a vow saying, If God be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. I'd missed that when we were studying this. to my father's house in peace. He had a stipulation there. Then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So he's making a commitment to God. At the beginning of that interchange, when God was talking to him, or Jehovah was talking to him, Christ, whoever, they were talking to him, and it said, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac, okay? And at the end of this, he's saying, you'll be my God if these things happen. I'm making a commitment to you. You bring me back to my father's house in peace, and I'm giving you a tenth of all. And he's confirming his commitment to God. And so what we see here is after his commitment to God, what does he get? Who's he introduced to that's the love of his life?
Rachel.
He's taken to a place that is where he was seeking, which was his mother's brother, which was to be a safe haven for him when he was out there with nothing really, right? He just had his staff and whatever he could carry with him. He might have had a camel. We don't know. It doesn't sound like it. But anyway, he didn't have much. And so God led him directly to the family he was seeking, and he was able to be blessed there by God. Now Laban, when we talk about work, how are we to work?
As for the Lord.
As for the Lord, right? So I work at Tanner. Loy Howard is the CEO. I know who Loy is. I've talked to him several times. I've had to do meetings with him and stuff. But I don't work as if I'm working for Loy Howard. And he doesn't actually want me to. He doesn't actually ask for that at all. He's pretty ready to acknowledge that there's a higher power, that there's a God in heaven.
Amen.
And so the doctor that I work under in my reporting structure, he's the chief medical officer, when I interviewed with him, he said, Tim, we want to be good stewards. I do too, right? So I want to be a good steward for God. And so I think that principle has to be present in our professional life, in our personal life, in wherever we are. And so that's what we see Jacob is doing, right? He's promising God, I will be a good steward. I'm going to return to you what you've asked for me. You will be my God, and I'm going to demonstrate it to everybody that I'm around, okay? So then we see there that Laban keeps him 7 years, and then what does Laban do? Gives him Rachel? No.
Get Leah first.
He got Leah first. Why did he do that?
Because he was doing such a great job that Laban was becoming wealthy under.
Laban was becoming wealthy. And later on, we see evidence of this because Laban said, no, please stay with me. Don't leave me because I've been blessed because of you, right?
Yeah.
And so what does that tell us about how Jacob worked? Faithfully. He used godly principles in his work, okay? God would not have blessed him had he not, right? He couldn't have blessed Laban because of Jacob without that, okay? So Jacob worked as if he was working for God. And he was very blessed because of it. Now, obviously, I think God allowed this to happen because Jacob had just done what? He'd done similar to his dad, right? And his brother. He'd kind of taken advantage and, misconstrued that. So I think God was allowing this to happen. So he had to work through it. It's a what we sow, we reap, right? And so he reaped that. Anyway, on Monday it talks about the blessing of work ideally. Why do we need to work as humans? Did it happen after the fall, before the fall? When were we said we were going to have to work?
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
The nature of
Before sin of...
Before sin
the
and
nature of the need changed, but it was always there.
Yes. Why do we need to work?
Life sustaining now. And to also keep our minds away from the devil, like the old saying, idle hands to the devil's workshop.
Idle hands is devil workshop. That's one that comes up to me, and I think that's why God cursed the ground for our blessing. Okay, He said, "I cursed the ground for you, your sake." I think that's why, because we needed to work even more. Maybe back then they did 20 hours a week. I don't know, but yes, sir.
No, I was gonna say what he said about idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Right?
It is true.
Yeah.
Especially, probably the younger you are.
Absolutely.
You know, the youth have lots and lots and lots of energy.
Yes.
If they can't find something constructive and useful that's profitable to themselves and someone else, they will get in trouble.
Yes.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it. They will.
Yes. So, I grew up in eastern Kentucky, one of the poor, Martin County, Kentucky. In 1964, April of 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson flew in a helicopter and announced his war on poverty. He sat on the front porch of a tar paper shack. Tom Fletcher and I think his 8 kids lived there with his wife. And when you look at Tom Fletcher, some of the papers have done articles about this. They've gone back and met with Tom Fletcher 25 years later. How has this war on poverty helped you? If you look up the war on poverty, Inez, Kentucky, or Martin County, you'll see articles 50 years after the fact saying the war on poverty is a bust. Right? The war on poverty here hasn't really changed this. It's still one of the poorest counties in America. The last article I read briefly last night was 2018, the unemployment rate, which was really from about 2016. Usually that's a little behind. Unemployment rate was about 11.7%. National average at that time was around 3. 50% of people that live in that county either have food stamps, SSI, disability, or Medicaid, or are on retirement. 50% of the county's not working, okay? It's only about 12,000 people, I don't know, 11,700. Still, 50 years after the war on poverty has kicked off, it's one of the poorest counties in the nation. Tom Fletcher came to my first grade class and talked to us. My teacher had Tom Fletcher, who he was sat on the porch and talked to him about. At that point, when Lyndon B. Johnson came, Tom Fletcher said, "Hey, I was working at a sawmill." I mean, he was making like, I don't know, $8,000 a year maybe. It was with 8 kids. You know what I mean? Like they lived in a 3-room shack, and his whole life, even with the war on poverty, that was where he lived. Okay, he never got to a better spot, and it was not great then. Anyway. So he came to my first grade class and talked about it, and what a great experience it was to meet Lyndon B. Johnson, Lady Bird, I think was what they called the wife, and other people that were there that were important dignitaries. And he said to our class he felt that Johnson was very sincere in wanting to battle poverty. He said, "I did not doubt the man's sincerity." He said, "But what I did see after I got on the dole," which is what they call it up there in Kentucky if you're on the government money, he was on Medicaid and got this, I don't know if he had disability, but anyway, he got food stamps and a stipend from the government because he couldn't find enough work. And he said, "I felt better about myself when I was making $8,000 a year because I was working. I felt like I was the man of my house. I felt like I was doing the best I could to provide for my family." And so later on down the road, if you read the story and look into it, talks about how his wife actually had life insurance on one of the kids and was indicted for murder because that was her way to get more money, okay? Now, he was not privy to that. The court found out, but it just goes to show that God gave us, when he talked to Adam, even after sin, what did he tell Adam? What was the first thing that he had for Adam? They were destined for death, okay? But what did he tell Adam? He gave him a hope, a way of escape, okay? When you see people that are impoverished and they don't have a hope, they don't see a way of escape, then they resort to other things, okay? They resort to their own methods. And Christ cares about us because as soon as they sinned, they were afraid of him and running from them because of their guilt. They knew they stepped outside of his will, and they were degrading themselves because of that. And they were like, oh, we've changed our opinion of him. He's not looking for our best interest. He's looking to punish us. And he was not. He was coming to give them hope in a future, and that this home is not our end point. We have a higher, better place that we're going. And so I still go to Kentucky frequently. I still see it. It's very much like an inner city, a rural inner city. That's why you see the opioid crisis really had its roots in Appalachia. You see a lot of, usually there's an article that says, well, if an area is primarily white or ethnocentric, they have better health outcomes and everything. The health outcomes in Martin County, Kentucky, it scores, out of 100, it scores 13. It's the lowest health outcome in America, okay?
Wow.
Lowest. And it's not because, it's not because of race or anything. It's because of there is just no interest, no hope, no desire to be healthy, right? There's just no motive for it for a lot of people. When I lived up there in the late 70s, early 80s to the mid 80s, we moved away in 1987 the last time. Well, no, I guess that was actually 90 when I left the last time. Sorry, we moved back there in 1987 for about 3 years, and then I moved here to Calhoun, Georgia in 1990. And at that point, coal mines were going. There was some jobs. Now there's not a single coal mine that's active in Martin County, Kentucky. There's not a one.
Wow.
And there used to be as many as 37.
Wow.
And that was the one source of income for that community that actually paid decently. And so there's a lot of people that will drive an hour one way to a job, but they feel like they need to be there for their parents or for their family, their extended family. And so they'll drive an hour to and from work to find work, meaningful work. There's a lot of people there that went to Columbus, Ohio, or somewhere like my uncles. I've had 4 or 5 uncles that went to Columbus, Ohio, and then returned after they had their pension and their retirement, and they could come back there and live, but they didn't live there during their working years. And so I think the blessing of work, like I'll talk to people at work and say, oh man, I don't know why we have to do this. It'd be great if we got paid and we didn't have to work to get it, right? Why can't that happen?
No.
But it's a God thing that it happens.
That is the ruination of people.
Yeah, it is.
When they get paid to work. And you mentioned your county.
Yep.
The county I grew up in, much the same thing.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that it's the same story. You can take color out of it.
Yeah.
Once you put a community on welfare,
Yes.
it wrecks them.
Well, and that's Ben Carson talks about it a lot, right? He grew up in an impoverished area, I think Chicago or Detroit. And Detroit is still an impoverished city, right? Like there's a lot of wealth there on certain parts of the town, but a lot of it's inner city that's pretty degraded. And Ben Carson talks about it. It's not about, like, he's the best articulator of the benefits of work and of trying to use godly principles to pull people up because he did it, right? He lived that in his life. Him and his brother both, he lived it. And I love reading his work. He's a phenomenal, insightful man that just he has a strong connection with godly principles, I believe.
Growing up in western Oklahoma, we saw the same thing with the American Indians that
Yes.
were put on.
Yes.
We were given government,
Yes.
recompense for what had happened, and
Yes.
they would have the same thing. Their communities would implode, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
Absolutely.
It's because
Alaskan
yeah,
territory because they have an income from the oil that's piped out of there. They get an income from the state. So there's a lot of, actual historically originated from Alaska that are very much alcoholic, similar to the
Drugs
Indians.
and alcohol seem to be
It's just prevalent.
really, really a problem in these communities, and it's not because of their, race or anything like that. It is because of the situation
Yeah.
that they end up finding themselves in, where hope and personal, like you were saying, having personal pride is just destroyed.
Yes. So to give an idea of how tough it was there, I'm sorry I'm off on a tangent, but we're going to keep talking about it. There is a point that I'm going to get to. My grandfather did multiple things to raise 20, so there were 22 children between him and 2 wives, to raise those children and provide for them. He was very industrious, okay? Very industrious. And of course, as the older kids were older, they could contribute to that industry, right? And so he would literally cut logs all year long and stage them at a certain spot near the creek that was down near our land up there in Kentucky. And when the floods came, they would, in the spring when the rain came and it flooded up there, they would tie those and float those down to Huntington, West Virginia for lumber. And so he had that income. They always had quite an extensive garden. And then he would do handiwork for other people. He would help build a house or help do whatever. And, and then he raised animals, right? And so the animals were part of their success, right? They could get meat, milk, eggs, whatever. To give an example, my mom gave me this when I was a kid. There's not much in Eastern Kentucky to do that was good, and that's part of my alcoholism. It's prevalent in my family on my mother's side that we're from there, very prevalent. And so as a kid, I get into drinking quite a bit. Before I did, I played pool a lot. And there was a pool hall that was a good local gathering. Johnny Stacy was the guy that owned it and ran it. He'd been in the Navy. And he didn't have a lot of personal pride. It was in Beauty, Kentucky. But Beauty was one of the ugliest little towns you've ever seen, okay? And it was just around the corner from Lovely. And neither of them were Lovely or Beauty, okay?
They were hopeful, right?
The names were, but they were not. And so I'll never forget Johnny Stacy. He was just kind of this large, big belly, slovenly. He'd have holes in his T-shirts and stuff. Good guy. But I went home one day and I said, Mom, Johnny's got some wisdom. And I was talking to her. She said, Tim, Johnny doesn't have delayed gratification. And so they lived across the holler or the creek when Mom, Johnny Stacy and his dad and family lived right across from Mom and her family within a quarter of a mile. And when Johnny was little, he got to crying, and the kids always interacted and everything. And she said, what's Johnny crying for? And one of Johnny's older brothers said, oh, he was wanting bacon, and we don't have any. Well, that's not an Adventist thing to have, right? This is ham, pork, bacon. And so they would raise hogs, and they would slaughter them, and they would put up the meat, and they had delayed gratification. Mom's dad was very intentional. He had a crop of animals that he raised and split and gained for the family. So he said, I don't have any bacon for little Johnny, but he said, I'm going to take him a pig, and I'm going to tell him, you need to raise this, and then you can have bacon. After it has some, you can have bacon. Delayed gratification. So he took him a pig, said, look, you bring it over, it can breed with my boar, and you can have offspring. About 4 months later, Mom said they heard the pig squealing. Well, Johnny was still crying for bacon, and his dad had gone ahead and slaughtered the pig and was going to make the bacon. So there's no delayed gratification, and that family did not do well. Johnny had a pool hall there. He ended up having a stroke and died a very not a good life. He lived in a nurse home for years. I used to visit him periodically when I would go home, and I don't know at the end if he knew I was even in the room. You know what I mean? It's just a horrible kind of existence, and just not, that's kind of the best it got up there. And so you're right, if there's not hope, if there's not things for people to do, the devil has more control, okay? And there's a lot of control up there. Tuesday, it talks about the earning years. And so that's typically 40 years in our life, right? We usually work about 20 to 60-ish, thereabouts. Would somebody turn, Robert, I'm going to give it to you. Will you turn to 1 Timothy 5:8? And Dick, will you do Proverbs 14:23?
Yep. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
Worse than an unbeliever. So did little Johnny's dad provide for his family by killing the pig before they'd had offspring? Not really, right? It was a very short-sighted choice, okay? So we're called to provide for our family, and that's a godly principle, right? That's a godly principle, and we're worse than an unbeliever if we don't do that part, okay? All right, Dick, have you got the other one?
That Proverbs 14.
23, yes, sir.
23. Got it. Okay. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. Penury, which is poverty.
Poverty.
Yeah.
So all work has profit. Talk doesn't really, right?
That's
It
why
leads
they
to
say talk is cheap.
talk is cheap, right, Dick? That's right. And so if we're just talking about it and we're not doing it, and I'm telling y'all, I think this is a strong biblical principle, okay?
Yes.
If we're coming to church and we're just hearing the word and we're not doing anything with that, that's like when we're looking at processes, there's this process mapping. I can't even remember the name of it right now. God, I used to have to do it all the time. But anyway, you have dead enders, right? It's just a circle. Well, that's the Dead Sea is a circle. It's a one way in and no way out, right? And so I don't think that's biblical. Like you talked about the stars in the crown, right? We are going to have others that we have had relationship with that result in them coming to God and to heaven. And so I think we can't just be a dead end thing. We have to have connections. We're called to have a relationship with God, but also with others. Colossians 3:23 and 24 says, whatever you do, work heartily, as if for the Lord and not for man, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. So,
Joseph seems to be one of the biggest examples of this specific idea in the Bible.
go deeper. Tell me more, Robert.
Well, he was faithful as a slave,
Whatever his circumstances.
and when tempted to sin, his reasoning was not because of my master, but because of God.
His master was up there. He worked as if it was for God, not for...
And he continued even when he became a prisoner.
Mhm.
And his faithfulness saved not only himself, but the entire nation of Egypt, his entire family, and perhaps a good chunk of that world.
Agreed.
Thousands.
Agreed.
People benefited from his
We have no idea how far-reaching that was.
Yeah.
work ethic.
The known world at that time. Yeah. He had a huge influence for good to the known world. Yep.
And the amazing thing, too, is Pharaoh was impressed to put him into that position from one conversation.
Yeah. Well, but who impressed him?
God did, of course.
The Holy Spirit.
I mean, those
Yeah.
dreams were given to him specifically for that.
Yes. Yes. And so that's the thing that I think that it doesn't matter. Like I'm telling you, when I was in Eastern Kentucky, it looked pretty bleak, right? I wasn't ever going to get a job in a coal mine. They worked on Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have a lot of opportunities. And I was really kind of lost up there as a teenager, I'll be honest. I didn't know what I was going to do. A lot of my peers were doing things that I would never be able to work in as an Adventist, right? And so, I had a buddy that he went to work for Anheuser-Busch delivering beer. That was one of the few good jobs that wasn't in a coal mine, right? And they made decent money. But that wasn't something I was going to be participating in. And so, it's kind of hard, like, it's really hard for kids in a younger age to have, okay, where do we go from here? But I will tell you, some of the most educated people I've ever been around come from Appalachia, in that they've rejected they saw their hope as education. Their one way out was education. Some people see it as sports, like football's a big thing up there, and basketball. Football's more recent. Like when I was a kid, it was all about basketball. Everybody had a hoop. Didn't matter if it was on the side of a barn with a dirt, no concrete at all, just on the dirt. And so, but having hope, that's the big thing that God gives us, right? We have a hope in something beyond this earth. We could look, if we spend time looking at this earth and what we have here from this earth, it's all vain. It's all dust, right? It all ends. But we have a hope in something bigger and greater, and that's an eternal hope. That's an escape from here. That's a heaven. That's a relationship with God that will not end. Wednesday it's talking about work with integrity. And so why should we work with integrity? What's important about working with integrity? We see that in Joseph's example. We see that in Daniel's example. Daniel's not radically different than Joseph. He didn't actually go to prison per se, but he was a captive. You could even argue that he was a captive in his body because he didn't have a great opportunity to have any progeneration, right? He was a eunuch, and so he had been physically deformed, and he could have gotten lost in that. You know what I mean? When that happened, that's a huge loss, right? What's your identity based in? If he had it based in his manliness, that might have been a thing, right? It could have totally derailed him. But on his way there, much like Joseph, when Joseph got separated from his father, he kind of made a pact with God, right? As he's seeing his father's lights or camp over in the distance, he's saying, you're going to be my God, much like Jacob did. Jacob said, you're going to be my God. Now, the difference was Joseph was what? 16, 14, I don't know, young. Jacob was like 70, okay? When he's going to look for his wife, he's like 70, so he's not necessarily youth. But we see this with Daniel. Daniel was young, and him and his 4 friends made a commitment to God, right? They made a commitment. Oh, man, we're in over our head. Our only hope is in God, and they made a commitment to God. And so when that's important for us, and it's important, like John was saying, if we make that commitment to God or we recognize him in our life as our touch point, our home base, our root, then the younger we make that commitment, the better off we are, the more likely we will have spiritual success.
I think one thing that I didn't see real strongly brought out in the lesson, is important in this, is that as Christians, we are a representative for God, and what we do should be a reflection on who we think he is.
Yes.
And others are going to see that, if we're claiming to be that, and they're going to get a picture of God based upon us.
Ellen G. White talks about a well-ordered home is one of the strongest witnesses, right, to others of God, right? So if we have our house in order, so to speak, and that's a living witness that's more powerful than a sermon frequently. Seeking godly counsel. We've kind of talked about this in that, being humble, having somebody that can hold you accountable is an important part of life. And so in Proverbs 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing for your flesh and refreshment to your bones. And so, I think that's the biggest part of spiritual success is God is our creator, God is our ruler, God in his rightful place in our life helps us have spiritual success. Does that equate to worldly success? I hope not. I hope not.
But it could.
It could, Daniel, you could argue he was very successful worldly. Joseph similarly, but I think the big point with both of them, they had tests. You know, Joseph, when he was younger, a test to cheat with the lady, and he said, I won't sin against Potiphar. I won't sin against God. He wasn't worried about Potiphar or the husband as much as he was about God and his relationship with God. And then, like Daniel early on, he kind of made his commitment. But I think that Abraham is another example. Job is another example of they had spiritual success and godly success. But I think that they each acknowledged God in their life in such a way that, you know, we talked about Abraham when he went and captured Lot back from the kings. He wouldn't take the rewards for that because he didn't want the king to be able to say, hey, I caused you to be wealthy. He wanted it to be God and God alone. And so he wanted his resources and income to come from God's blessing.
Solomon is one of the greatest examples of this dichotomy because he asked for spiritual success. God gave him both.
Well, he asked for wisdom to
Well,
rule.
The wisdom is the spiritual understanding to deal with his people, in a way, in my opinion, because godly wisdom only comes from God.
Yeah.
Right? But what I'm getting at is, in that wisdom, he was also blessed with the worldly success,
Yes.
unlike any other.
Yes.
And it became a trap for him. And through his wisdom, he explained that in his writings, how, in the end, the vapor and sand,
Yes.
how
Meaningless.
all this
Yes.
stuff was absolutely worthless.
Yes. Without God. Yeah.
Compared to God, compared to heaven. But yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
I think that's what we all have to hope for and pray for, is that we have godly success. We have to look for another home, not just here. Yes, sir.
Let's go back. I'd like to go back to Abraham for just a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Before the call from God to sacrifice his son, I got the impression that Abraham was committed to God, that he had trusted God, a whole range of things where he had shown that he had learned his lessons
Yeah.
from the earlier life. Why does God call for this supreme test into a person that was basically a pretty good guy? If I can,
Yeah.
I
Sure.
don't know if that's
Sure.
a term like it. Is there something that that the test was going to bring out that could have only happened as a result of the test?
I think.
wonder if it was Isaac that needed it more than Abraham.
I think that if you look, like I don't know this because I'm not a theologian or scholar of this degree, but I have heard theologians talk about how where Abraham came from, child sacrifice was a big part of their culture. And that's part of why God called him out, you know, to leave that. And that maybe God was working on him about that to some degree. You know what I mean? His view of God was just slightly off still because of that. And this was his, and he, you know, the cool thing about Abraham, he testified God will provide a sacrifice, right? And he was looking, and he didn't know if it was going to be his son or who, but even, I think he'd already rationalized if it is him, he can bring him back to life. You know what I mean? And so he was already looking at it, and so I think it demonstrates his shift in his perspective of God, because even when, you know, he was still kind of muddying through things with Isaac in going with Hagar to make his own progeneration without God's blessing. And, you know, when him and Sarah were talking about it and she laughed, you know what I mean? They still had a little doubt in there, and I think God was trying to get rid of all that.
Was Abraham's picture of God different when he went up the mountain and when he came down?
Oh, absolutely.
Was there a change in Abraham's picture or understanding of God?
I think so.
I think he understood more what God would have to feel and go through in sacrificing his own son on the cross for
Yeah.
us. And I think the love of God burst out of his heart in a new way.
I would hope so. I hope that we can withstand those tests, because that's a huge test, right? I mean, that's, you know, I don't know what our test will be. I think each of our tests would be slightly different because of our background and our history and in our experience, but we'll all have a big test. And so I think if we focus on a heavenly home and Christ is our creator, Christ is our author, our finisher, our foundation, then we're in a much better spot than folks that don't. All right, our time is up. Let's bow our heads. Dear Father, thank you for your love. Thank you for your watch care over us. Thank you for the wonderful dialogue and your word and your Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth as you have promised. And thank you for our ability to gather together and hear different perspectives and viewpoints that we wouldn't imagine if we were just reading this by ourselves at home. Please bless us as we go into the church service, and bless Pastor Ian as he brings the message. In Jesus' name.